So Ruth Avery is hull number 7 of the Gilmer 31s. I'm told that when Clark Ryder built the Southern Cross 31s, somewhere around hull 120, they started renaming the boats they only partially finished as Gilmer 31s. Partially finished being just hull deck and main bulkheads, and then called the fully finished boats Southern Cross 31s. So Ruth Avery is hull number 7 of the Gilmer 31s. So she's probably somewhere around hull 125, 130 of all the boats that Clark Ryder built to this design. And her hull was laid up in 1984. So Ruth Avery was first launched in 1991 after being completed by her first owner, Meade Breeze, who was a sail and canvas maker in Rock Hall, Maryland. Then she sat out of water in Rock Hall for 9 years until I purchased her in February of 2001. Meade completed the boat. He also gave her the gaff rig and never installed an engine. And so she's been engineless from the start. He also gave her the name Ruth Avery, which is his mother's maiden name. Well, if with her traditional lines and gaff rig, Ruth Avery can be said to be a dream machine, then I was certainly a sucker from the start. After purchasing her, I quit my job and moved aboard in the early summer of 2001. And moved the boat to Long Cove Marina, where I spent about 7 weeks fitting her out. And then I launched her in late August and began my journey down the Chesapeake Bay toward the sea. In November of that year, I sailed from Hampton, Virginia to Bermuda, my first offshore passage in the boat. And all went reasonably well, if I recall. And from then I continued on to St. Martin and spent the winter going down the Leeward and Windward Islands in the Caribbean, ending up at the Virgin Islands. And I got the fever to go west, and I was still a relatively young man then. So I sailed her to Galveston, Texas, and put her on a truck and trucked the boat to Dana Point, California. And then in June of 2002, I sailed directly from California to Nuku Hiva, passage which took me 26 days. And then did the coconut milk run across the South Pacific and down to New Zealand, spent the cyclone season in New Zealand 2002, 2003. When the America's Cup was going on. I remember that. So in the fall of 2003, the fall in the southern hemisphere, I headed north to Fiji, and then to Vanuatu, and then through the Torres Strait to Darwin, Australia. And then from Darwin began my trek across the Indian Ocean to Cocos Keeling, to Rodrigues, Mauritius, and Reunion Island, and then on to Richards Bay, South Africa. Then I journeyed down around the south of Africa on a series of coastal hops, rounding Cape Agulhas and coming into Simonstown. And then from Simonstown down around the Cape of Good Hope, and beginning my crossing of the Atlantic to Santa Lena. And then from Santa Lena, my longest passage to date, 3,800 miles from Santa Lena to St. Lucia in the Windward Islands. And I believe that was in April of 2004. And so there I completed my circumnavigation of the world. Back then I did not even have a battery in the boat. I was using kerosene running lights. I was shooting on Ektachrome film, so those photos you see are from slides. I had a Photoshop take pictures of the slides and convert them to digital images. So following the world voyage in the fall of 2004, I put the boat up on the Hard in Brunswick, Maine, and went back to work for a few years. While I was landlocked and on the money-making treadmill, I was also thinking about, of course, another voyage, but also all the modifications I wanted to make to the boat, all the things I had been thinking about on my previous voyage. And so I made quite a few modifications to the interior. I modified the gaff rig a bit. I had already done some modifications to it. I lowered the peak angle on the gaff and added a topsail. I also changed the self-steering wind vane. The Aries needed a complete rebuild, but instead of doing that, I opted to install the Hasler type trim tab vane, which is what I have now. So I finally launched Ruth Avery again in late November of 2008 and set off for Bermuda. If I remember, it was December 2nd, from Brunswick, Maine. And I remember that passage. It was a miserable trip, but I made it okay, and then continued on to the Virgin Islands. And now I've been going between the East Coast, the U.S. East Coast, and the Caribbean seasonally now for the past 10 years. So let's start up at the bow here. Go out on the end of the bowsprit. So as you can see, nice beefy bronze krantz iron. Then we have the two Whisker Stays. Now these are bronze rod Whisker Stays, which are quite heavy. And in fact, the bob stay here, which you can see my foot is on, that also used to be bronze rod, and I replaced it with Dynex ducks, which is much lighter. The bronze is just quite heavy, and plus you have all this weight way out at the end of the boat, which causes her bow to plunge more when you get into swells. The only problem I've had with the Dynex ducks is actually tensioning it, and you can see right there. What I've used is lashing and then those bulldog clips, and so what I've done is I used the windlass, a piece of line attached to the end of the lashing, and use the windlass to tighten the lashing, and then clamp it with the bulldog clamps to hold it in place until I actually tie a knot. Otherwise, just trying to tighten it and then tie a knot on the lashing, it just becomes loose almost instantly. So my current anchor, my main anchor setup is 10 fathoms of 5/16 BBB chain, and then I have after that spliced on. Then after that I have spliced on 150 feet of 5/8 inch nylon. So I use a combination rode. So that gives me a total anchor rode of about 200 feet. And since the end of it is nylon, I can easily tie on more line if need be. Now at the end of that 60 feet of chain is a 44-pound Spade Anchor, which I just changed to this year. I used to have a 35-pound Delta, and before that I had a 35-pound CQR. The CQR did not work very well at all. If you recall, I had a video on second anchors, and if I look like I was in good practice running out a second anchor, I owe that to the CQR, because whenever the wind got up or there was a threat of showers or thunderstorms, I was always running out a second anchor just in case, simply because I could not trust that anchor to hold, even though it had held me through some pretty bad weather. Sometimes it would hold, sometimes it wouldn't. The Delta worked much better than the CQR. It set faster and generally seemed to have better holding power, but again, I had problems with big wind shifts, especially right here on the bay with the soft mud. A couple times it happened in thunderstorms. The anchor just suddenly pulled out and started dragging. And occasionally just wind shifts in moderate weather, it would just pull out and start dragging. So far the Spade Anchor has, I have not had any problems with it whatsoever. And we're just coming up on 1 year, and I've used it in the Virgin Islands, in Florida, and now on the bay. I've been through 2 thunderstorms on the bay with it, and so far it sets fast and holds. Now here we are on the foredeck. Presently I have my solar panels laid out here, and you can see the forward hatch, and then I just use a hatch stick. There used to be whatever the thingies that you could adjust it that would hold the hatch up, but those didn't work too well, so I just took them off, and now I just use the old, just use the very low-tech hatch stick, which works quite well. So moving further aft, on the port side, we come to the pin rails on the port side, and the pin rails on the port side I use to belay the jib halyard here, and then the staysail halyard. And you notice the staysail halyard goes down through a turning block. That's mainly so when you have both the jib and the staysail set, the tension on the pin rail is going in opposite directions. If they're both pulling on the same side in the same direction, you'll get a lot of torque, which will tend to rotate the pin rails. So in this way, the tension, the torque created by the tension, more or less they offset each other. And then the green line at the very end is my topsail halyard, and that's Dyneema. That's very strong. So actually, I use that. I also use the topsail halyard to haul up a rope, which I'll use to climb up on with my ATN mast climber, which is a way of climbing the mast solo, which I detailed in another video. So now we're on the starboard side pin rail, and I want to bring your attention to a few details of the standing rigging. What we're looking at right here are my upper shrouds. Since I modified the rig, I actually lowered the mast slightly. Those shrouds are new, and those are 1/4 inch 1x19 wire, and those are traditionally spliced terminals, which is an interesting learning experience, learning how to splice wire rope. And then forward of it, those are the original terminals, and I don't think anybody makes them anymore. And I'm told what basically the way they work is that the wire goes into those bronze cones you see, and then they splay the wire, and then there's an epoxy-like compound they put in there. Anyway, they've stood up for as long as I've had the boat, which is 17 years now, so it seems to work pretty well. So just after the mast is the spare propane tank, which is under that little canvas cover there. And you can see there's a bracket bolted to the cabin top, and then the tank is lashed to the bracket. I like to store a spare tank on deck. That way you don't have any worries about propane leaks getting down into the boat and possibly causing explosions. So here are the running backstays, and as you can see they got 4-part tackle on them. These were originally wire, and I replaced them with Dynex ducks, and use what's called a modified Brummel splice right here, which is quite easy to do. And Dynex ducks has very little stretch, basically comparable to wire, but it's much lighter, and it's also much more flexible, and it's especially good for running backstays, because it's much easier on your sail. Often the lee backstay, when it's slacked, because of the motion of the boat, will swing about and slap against the mainsail. And when those backstays are heavy and they're wire, that tends to wear your sail, especially the stitching. It tends to chafe against the stitching and pull the stitching out of the sail. So now we're back in the cockpit. So you can see she's got a nice big long tiller here that goes to the rudder, and the main sheet comes aft to the cockpit. as well as the Genoa sheets. And I also use these winches for to tension the running backstays. And then we have self-tailing winches to tend to the staysail. And that's also a modification I made. Originally she had a club boom on the staysail and a traveler forward. But I wanted the increased area and added efficiency of a loose-footed staysail that could overlap the mast slightly. And then I have my Techno Tower, whereas my radio, VHF radio antenna is mounted, and also just aft of it is my stern light. And that light is up high enough so that when I have the air paddle on the wind vane, the light is still higher than the air paddle, the wind vane, so it doesn't get blocked. So my stern light doesn't get blocked when the air paddle swings in front of it. And then the bronze oarlock, which presently I have the dinghy painter run through. That's for the sculling oar. And then under here we have a sealed locker for the propane tank, and that has a drain that goes overboard, so if there's any gas leakage, the propane will go overboard and not down into the boat. And in the cockpit we have the usual cockpit bench lockers, and this is the port side locker. And here is the starboard side locker. And once again, this is a live-aboard cruising boat, so all the lockers are stuffed with stuff. And right here we have old-fashioned boom gallows. And I still keep my old Avon Red Start dinghy. That used to be my main dinghy, and now it's just a backup dinghy. The biggest advantage of inflatables is right here, is that you can fold them up and stow them. Other than that, I've found that hardshell dinghies are much better. They row much better, they sail better, they have more capacity. They look a lot nicer, but they are a pain to stow. Oh, and of course don't forget the ship's bell. And somewhere on there is engraved Ruth Avery, 1991, which is when the previous owner launched this boat and also gave it the name.